Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Wargame Academy. In today's episode we are going to discuss the units. We're going to be discussing our unit series, and we're going to start with the logistics category. The logistics category basically is the category of units that houses your command units and your supply units, and we are going to go ahead and start with command units. Command units are one of the most necessary, if not the one thing you have to have in a deck, no questions asked. Because you cannot make a deck without command units, because command units are one of the key things in this game. You cannot capture sectors without command units, and thus you cannot earn income without command units. Basically, like in sectors on the map, you want to place these little units in certain spots and capture them and basically earn income for your team to call in more reinforcements. And so there's a lot of these. Like, you figure like it's just like something like, okay, well, each country just have one, but no, there's different command units with different statistics, different values, different points, so on and so forth. So we're going to go through each individual type. So first what we're going to discuss, since it's first on the list, is our command helicopters. Command helicopters, one of the weirdest command units in this game. They're relatively priced from what I'm seeing, typically 100 points apiece. This availability, I'm not quite sure because I'm not looking in like the deck building for this, but their availability is typically at medium, so you can probably get like a card of 4 or 5 of these, actually probably 3. But they are also some of the most vulnerable command units because they have to land in order to capture a sector, and they can't land in like places that are well hidden. They have to like land out in the open in command sectors. So that means that they are very susceptible to being barraged by enemy artillery. So command helicopters I typically don't recommend when making a deck. If you want to do that, go ahead. But just be warned that it could be easily mortared or artillery pretty easily. The nice thing about helicopter commands though is that they have pretty good speed in comparison to other commands, so you can easily capture sectors pretty quickly and early in a match using command helicopters. Next on the list are actually even more useful command units, which is command infantry, and this is basically like a 5-man squad armed with an assault rifle and some kind of machine gun to defend itself. And they come in their own transports, which have to actually be unloaded in order to capture a sector. Like, you can't just bring in a HQ section and a Pinsgauer and just put it in like a forest and say, oh, it's captured. You have to actually unload the command squad from that sector in order to capture that particular sector you want. These are actually pretty good because transports are pretty decent selection depending on your country. You can get them even in helicopters, which I would recommend more than a helicopter CV. And their stealth is typically pretty good, so they have greater chances of not being detected in comparison to other command units. You can even stick command squads in building sections, although that is somewhat obvious sometimes. But these generally are pretty useful command units, or the command squads, because like I said, they can get really good transport. You can get them in ground transports, or you can get them in helicopter transports, depending on your play style. But don't expect them to be able to defend themselves completely. Command squads should usually be supported by other infantry or vehicles, because if they're spotted, most line infantry can even take out command squads. Next type of command are tracked command vehicles. Typically what these units are either some form of a lightly armored armored personnel carrier like the M11-4A1, which has light armor values, so it can sustain maybe 1 or 2 hits with an enemy RPG, or your command tanks. Now, the armored personnel carriers or infantry fighting vehicles are decently priced for the most part. They're cheaper than command tanks, and they have some armor depending on which one you pick. And they, depending on the vehicle, like the BMP 1K has its 73 millimeter like cannon and a Malyutka ATGM that can defend itself against vehicle threats, but it can't defend itself against infantry. Typically, these commands you want to keep away from the front lines. These are ones you want to keep in the back of your front lines so that they can avoid being detected. Again, their availability is better than command vehicles. Command tanks, on the other hand, are some of your most powerful command vehicles. They typically have the greatest armor value, have a cannon that can really defend themselves against other tanks, and typically has a machine gun that can defend itself against infantry. Now, these are best used when trying to capture sectors in the front line. So, like, the sector that sees the most combat is the perfect place for a command tank. Like, T-80 UK has the highest armor, so it can sustain a few hits to its front. So this is a good unit to bring in to a front line, like in a match of conquest, to capture the sector, just to get an advantage of the enemy. I'm trying to think if there's any other tracked. Most of these vehicles, however, are armed with just a machine gun, so it can only defend itself against infantry, and even then that's very difficult to do, because once infantry spot a command, all they need to do is fire their anti-tank weapon at it and it's destroyed. The armor on these things are not really that great, so you need to be very protective of these vehicles. Command tanks, on the other hand, they can take a couple hits, but you still need to protect them and make sure they're hidden. Next up, we're going to be looking at wheeled commands, and these are typically like either your armored personnel carriers, I keep saying characters for some reason, that are wheeled, like the Fuchs Fufu, or the SBW-60, or you can get the basically the unarmored jeeps. The unarmored jeeps are your cheapest command vehicles, and typically have the highest availability, typically of 8 or 7 units per card. And these are ones that are the most vulnerable, though, because even light mortars or light artillery can easily stun and kill these units. So these are the units that you want to especially protect, and these do not belong on the front lines. Typically, that's only where command tanks should go. The wheeled armored personnel carriers, I can't talk today, they're a little bit better at being protected because they typically have better armor than the jeeps, but you also want to keep these away from the front lines because they're also very vulnerable to enemy infantry. But they're typically better, like the wheeled commands are better because of their speed on ground, which means like they can relatively and stealthily capture a sector and be very quick about it. And like I said, they're typically the cheapest command units. Moving on, we're going to be talking about supplies. Every army needs like a really good supply network in order to function properly. Because if your units run out of fuel or you run out of ammunition, then things will start to go bad immediately. And the same, that's for real life and in Wargame. In Wargame, your units have all sorts of supply values that need to be looked at. Typically higher end units are going to be more supply hungry than lower end units, especially like ATGMs or ATGM infantry. Their weapons are going to take up more supplies than an infantry squad, for example. So, yeah, so basically like you have to, when you're building a deck, you need to consider like how much supplies this unit will take up. So like things like autonomy and fuel need to be looked at. And so that should help you decide what kind of supplies you actually want. The first and most basic logistics unit for supplies is forward operating base, otherwise known as a FOB or FOB. Now, as you can see, you can't view it in the armory here, but this is basically like the only building you can get in this game. And this can only be deployed at the beginning of a match, which is basically the deployment phase when you're sitting down all your units. And almost all the FOBs basically have the same supply value of 16,000 liters. So this is basically like your central hub for all supply operations. This is where you want to send your supply helicopters, your supply trucks back to rearm, well, not rearm, but basically to refuel their supplies, and then they can basically be sent up to the front line to resupply your units. Or if you have helicopters and to be resupplied, FOBs are really good places to send your helicopters back to rearm. So FOBs, they're not necessary in all battles, but you should definitely pack a card of these in any deck, and you should try and keep your supply network going by utilizing these forward operating bases. They're very important. Next type of supplies are supply helicopters. Now these are nice because typically they have the greatest amount of supply values. Like the CH-53, which is one of my personal favorites, has 3,700 liters of supply, so it has a huge supply capacity. The downside of these are that their availability is rather limited when compared to supply vehicles, and the fact that they are airborne. They can get to the battlefield quick, which is nice because their speed is better than most vehicles, but they can easily be targeted by enemy anti-aircraft assets like manpads or SPAGs if they choose to kill these units, because nobody decides... Okay, I should rephrase it. Some players have it on default to attack supplies while others do not, so if you spot like a huge... What is it? Where's that? Mi-26, usually people will try and kill this with artillery or anti-aircraft units because this is 120 points and this has a lot of supply. So if this is found sitting near enemy units and you manage to kill it, its explosion will possibly kill units in the close vicinity. So that's another thing you have to consider with supplies, is their capacity, especially when you're placing it near your units, because if it dies, then it can possibly stun or kill units near it. So typically, like, the availability of helicopters is lower than that of supply vehicles, and they're typically vulnerable, but they have their uses, and they can quickly resupply units on the front line. And last but not least, we have supply vehicles, and these are typically just like trucks or other sorts of vehicles. Soviets have an armored supply vehicle, which means like it can resist most machine gun damage. But these are typically your vehicles with the least amount of supplies. 800 liters is the typical amount, but some of these heavier trucks have more. And usually the more expensive the supply, the more supplies it can carry, but the less availability you have. So like this, you can have a high availability of these, but it has less supply, while like a cart of Mankadis has decent amount of supplies for a vehicle, but you get less availability of it. Okay, so that is the end of this episode for logistics. In the next episode, we are going to be talking about infantry and all the different types of infantry that you can pick. So if you enjoyed, leave a like, comment, and subscription, and I will see you in the next episode. Goodbye.